I think that when you're talking about barriers to safer sex, it depends upon the person that you're talking about. And for gay men in their 40s and 50s, I think that there is absolutely an element of fatigue around condoms, around prevention, around for the fact that for 30 years this has been a part of our lives, and we're just kind of, we're fed up with it. We know the risk, we know the spill, we've gone through it, we've survived the 80s, first half of the 90s, and you know what? I think that for some gay men in their 40s and 50s, they had just made a decision that they're going to take a calculated risk, because the fact is that a condom for some people is a barrier for intimacy, and they would just rather not have it. And so I think that is something that those of us who do this for a living have to kind of remember. We've been pushing condoms, and I'm as big a condom pusher as Michael is, but for 30 years, that's been the reality for the generation just ahead of mine. And I think for younger individuals, which was my area of expertise for many, many years, it's just the opposite. It's having not lived through the 80s, it's having no frame of reference about going to a funeral a week. And, you know, we say that, and when I say that to young people, they're like, oh, you're embellishing. You know, they don't really believe that that was the way that it was. And so for them, it's completely new. They have gone their entire lives with HIV. They've gone their entire lives with panels like this about prevention. And so that's kind of where they come into the conversation. And so, and then you have the whole, which I think is the third most important type of person, which is the type of person where they are going to do whatever they believe is the normative behavior. Meaning that if I were to ask all of you, did you bathe today? And I said, raise your hand if you bathed today. Most of you would probably raise your hands whether you bathe or not, because the assumption is that it's an expectation that you bathe every day. So depending on what your community norm is, if you're in a community where the expectation is that you will use a condom, then even if you don't use one, then you're probably going to report that you do. If you're in a community where that's not the norm, if you're a person of color, if you are any other type of person where the norm is not necessarily use a condom, then you're not even going to know to say that when asked, because that's not the norm. So I think norm, and then kind of like your perspective is things that come about that.
There's a follow-up I want to get to. We have one question here with Dave.
Yeah, I was saying, can you hear me?
I'm having trouble hearing myself. There's the air conditioners up. My hearing's bad now.
So all those rock concerts, right? I saw you there at the Capitol Center. You mentioned the drop-off in condom use from teens to 20s. What do you attribute that to? What are the surveys or your information attribute that to? And also, if you had anything follow-up from what this other gentleman was saying about people in their 40s and 50s, he mentioned fatigue. Are there any other reasons why it's dropping off?
Well, I think there's a combination of factors. One, people start getting into relationships. When they get into relationships, they stop using condoms. There are people who sort of believe also that HIV only belongs to a certain age group, and therefore it's only the very young who get HIV. So, I mean, I think those are, and then I think people start making these calculations that gay men are making deliberate choices about, some of it is the same as, I mean, adults as well as young people, but adults making the decision that it's the same kinds of things, trust factors, that this person would not be telling me something else, that my judgment is good enough to know that that person wouldn't be doing that, or wouldn't be disclosing information to me. So, I mean, the other thing is that unlike, say, something that you have to do that, you have to wear glasses because you can see. If you didn't wear your glasses, you can see that the condom is only going to be at that time when you're having sex. So it's always that, there's always a decision and a case-by-case basis. And that's, some of the data gaps for me is to try to get a better sense of condom use over a period of time, because our surveys, we always ask condom use at last sex. Now, again, there could be a normative factor in there because you're doing a survey about sex and you should be wearing a condom. It's always self-reported. People always ask me, you distributed 5 million condoms. Do you know how many of those were used? And I said, well, other than the ones where we put the chick in it, which is not true, Metro Weekly, or the spy cams. No, none of that. We don't know for sure, and it's always self-reported. So people might be actually saying they are or they aren't. But when you start asking people like, okay, the last time you had sex, but this time before that, the partner before that, then I think you start getting a truer picture. And we've started now asking that question of gay men in our behavioral study. And I think we'll get a truer picture of really where condom use is. I think it is lower than what we've heard reported at last sex, where this survey told us 60% use condom at last sex. And I think also, again, once you start having that, okay, I've seen this guy 2 or 3 times now, then we can move on to the next level of this relationship, and that means not using a condom.
Actually,
Trying to figure out how to make a simple question. Your point about asking about condom use and last time I had sex, I think it's an important one because I've seen data from the CDC that shows that the drop-off from someone who consistently uses condoms all the time to someone who uses them most of the time, the efficacy is hugely different. Like 80-some% for the all the time and 20-some% for the most of the time. So basically, like as soon as you get into the next category, which is probably most people, the efficacy of that drops way off. So I'm not even sure how useful to ask about the last time I had sex. But anyway, I wanted to like throw out there, and I was actually going to do an act up back then. I was 45, so there was a lot to do back then. I think the prevention messages that we've had available, because of restrictions of funding, because of social norms and so on, have been extraordinarily heterocentric. And I think that has really done tremendous damage to the STEM community. And I think that even the abstinence-based message, which has always been out there and still lives, is about heterosexuals. It's not about gay men. Because the assumption in the abstinence-based prevention message is that at some point in your life you're going to get married and be monogamous in that marriage. And at that point you can let it fly and do what you want to do. And that paradigm doesn't speak to gay people, because when you're sitting there and in your health ed class or whatever and you're talking about abstinence, you're talking to my heterosexual friend, you're not talking to me. And so I think that this relates to some about, like, as you get older as a gay man, that drop-off makes sense to me, because the power of the intimacy of skin-to-skin contact is amazing. That's really powerful stuff. The dopamine rush that you get in that moment of intimacy, if I want to be with this person and so on, is really incredible. And I understand the power of that. And to be told that you have to use a condom for the rest of your life, forever, ever, never, and always, even if you have a partner that's a stable partner, because gay people are really promiscuous, because probably cheating on you, you probably have no relationship. So you should just continue to use that condom. I think it's an unrealistic message. And so, but I think that's what the message has been for 30 years, is that the only answer is you just got to keep using a condom forever, ever, 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 ever. And it makes total sense to me that that's totally unrealistic. And so, with that being said, I just want to put it out there that, so what is a realistic message to the MSM community? What is the real conversation that should be happening? And how do we get away from the model